Hey there, Modern World History students. This is Sanchez, and we're going to go ahead and begin with one of our first flipped video lectures. And today's topic, we're going to do a little bit of review from our initial discussion, and we're going to dive into something called absolutism and divine right of kings. Alright folks, before we begin today, just a quick reminder I put on the screen right now. When we're taking flipped lecture notes, I want to make sure that we're using a format, because we want to be careful while you're listening to the lecture today, just not simply copying everything down word for word so it's a solid block or a solid paragraph. Really want to try to practice using a structure. So I gave you some structures, perhaps you've used in other classes, and I'll let you kind of experiment to find one works for you. One tried and true method that I would strongly suggest is the Cornell note method. If you've ever taken an Avid strategy class or involved in that program, basically the premise is that you create a left-hand column, and that will serve as a place to write questions and key ideas, and the bulk of our notes, whatever I lecture about today, will be on the right-hand column. At the very bottom you have a short summary to kind of summarize and put in your own words from today's discussion. Another great strategy is something called three-column notes, where you put the heading on one column, in the middle will be the chunk of your notes, and then an additional column off to the side. Then you can write additional notes from the book, maybe go back through with your questions. Outline method is another strategy a lot of students like to use. Maybe Roman numerals, bullet 1, slide 1, indent through. And again, for all of these, including the outline, definitely you want to space your notes out so you have some time to necessarily have a break, not reading that solid block. The last one, again, you might consider using is something called a mind map. So if you're more that kind of visual learner, more kind of hands-on learner, maybe that traditional outline method doesn't work for you. Maybe, again, you kind of, put the word globalization in the middle, and again, little bubbles out remind you in terms of what that would involve, or human rights, what does that look like? Notice at the bottom I reminded you that all your notes, when I do check your notebook, and yes, I do check those notebooks, I should see evidence of annotation, talking to the text, questions, highlighting, so all that good stuff goes into a flipped lecture note. Alright, so before we dive into our discussion of government and absolute kings and monarchy, I put on the screen that we're still addressing or laying the foundation. I call them essential questions. And in essence, what we're talking about for the course of the year, the question is posed, what historical developments have actually affected change in citizens' rights? So we've started thinking about what does it mean to have rights and what type of rights. You may also be thinking about who has rights and who doesn't. So when we look at these different periods in different countries and different regions around the world, and we also are going to have a discussion throughout the course of the year, what is the relationship between the government or the state or the nation? How do we balance that with an individual's own rights, their human rights or civil rights, etc.? So we did introduce again the concept of rights, so at this point you definitely have notes in your logbook. So we introduced U.S. citizen rights, which in basic sense are the basic liberties and freedoms. A lot of you tied this back to 8th grade history, looking at something called the Bill of Rights. So when you say United States citizen rights, a lot of you, again, we think about freedom of speech. You have the right to express yourself. We have the freedom of religion. We have the right to bear arms. We have the right to a fair and speedy trial. We have the right to innocent till proven guilty. We have the right to vote. So those types of rights and privileges that were established when we started our country in the 1700s, that's something, again, we take for granted maybe sometimes, but it's rightly, again, rooted in our country. The second type of rights we introduced in class was something called civil rights. And when we start looking at civil rights, and this really connects to our current world we're living in, we're looking at making sure that rights are protected for individuals, that they're not facing any discrimination, they're not receiving any type of harm or racism. We looked at, again, looking at there's no persecution or denial rates based on their gender, based on their class, based on their ethnicity, based on their disability, etc., etc. And then the last one we spent some time looking at in the article that you T4'd was a document known as the United Nations Charter of Human Rights. And this document was created in 1945 and basically wanted to establish a working document the entire world could address to think about what does it mean to have human rights. As a human, what I am entitled to. So in class we talked about through the jigsaw things like a concept of just simply, again, no slavery, the right to travel free across the world, the access to health care, the right to education, the right to freedom of expression. So this document was established in the 1948-1949, but one could argue that we still have countries around the world that do not necessarily follow this charter, this document, or again violating human rights around the world. The second piece we introduced, we talked about something called globalization. So our second kind of essential question to guide us through the course of the year is how had globalization affected those rights? So when you think about globalization, in your notebook you should have a definition similar to the one on the screen. I want you to tie it to interaction, that interconnection piece. For a lot of you, you hear globalization and boom, you think trade, which is correct. There's definitely economic globalization. But there's also interconnection just on ideas, and on language, and on culture, and on people. So globalization is more just than the money and trade, even though of course that's a big piece of it. But also we could argue that again, globalization is tying and spreading those ideas. So some of our questions, how is the world becoming interconnected? So how does globalization affect people or people's rights or different countries and then economy? And then why this modern period? Remember, I keep referring to the period that we're going to study together in class as modern world history. So roughly about 1700s up to 1980s. How is the modern period defined by global conflict and cooperation? So throughout our units, we're going to see, because the world is increasingly coming together with connections, obviously if it's coming together, it's going to have to work together. It's going to have to compromise. It's going to have to give. It's going to have to take. Sometimes that's not an easy task, and sometimes, again, people want to take more than their share, and perhaps that could cause a conflict or a power struggle when we get to wars, when we get to rebellions. So how rights and globalization, that's really why we wanted to start the class, is really set the stage, because those are major themes throughout the course of the year. Now in class, we also kind of tied our discussion of globalization and citizens' rights. I introduced one of our questions talking about power. So what does it mean to have power, and how do people exercise their power? How do we organize and structure that process? And one of the things I definitely want you to get down in your notebook, which a lot of you kind of tied to class, is this concept of government. A lot of you connected to the fact that the people in power, the people in charge, how do we control things? Basically throughout history, people have known the need for something to actually, organize and structure power, authority. And we call that government. So government is a system for controlling society, but government is not one size. There's not one way or one strategy to form a government. There are many ways that you can choose to organize and divide power in a society. So on the screen right now, there's a few that I want to introduce, kind of the basic foundations, the major forms of government. And we could trace this all the way back even to when we go into ancient times, Greece and Rome. So for the most part throughout history, people have lived under single rulers, such as kings. This type of rule is called a monarchy. And in some cases, which we're going to look at today, rulers have most of the power or total power or absolute power. Other governments, we could say they've developed something called an aristocracy. An aristocracy is a state that's ruled by a noble class. So if someone's noble, they usually have a high family status, they have title, they have land, they have wealth, they have power. Later, as trade expanded, a class of wealthy merchants, so people that were trading and business people, they were the ones that really ruled the land. This was known as the oligarchy. And the last one on the far right, which is something you may be more familiar with, is a concept known as democracy. In the basic premise, democracy, we're talking about the power or the authority or the control rests with the people. The people themselves can govern themselves. This concept is, over time, something that's grown slowly. And one can argue, again, there's certain places where democracy has found success. Again, case in point, the United States. And there are other areas where democracy has not been a strong solution, and you can definitely see evidence around the world. So I want to go into focus today on monarchy. So if we're talking about the role of the citizen and citizens' rights and government's role in that, again, really, how does that change over time? We have to look at, of course, how does it start? And really, a monarchy, I mentioned before, that is a state that's ruled by a king. So if we're talking about a king or we're talking about a queen, I put up there it's ruled by hereditary, meaning this is something that's passed down from generation. It's within the bloodline. It's within the family. Traditionally, again, if a king has a child, a son, and he passes away, that crown, that monarchy will be transitioned and it will go to the son, and then his son, and his son after, and shortly down the line. So in this case, monarchy, but I really want to focus on something called in your textbook absolute monarchy. Now, throughout history, we have had cases where we have kings and queens and rulers, of course, amazing leaders, and have a tremendous amount of wisdom and making wonderful decisions in terms of their government, working with different representative groups. But we also have cases throughout history, kind of where we're starting from, is something called absolute monarchy. And if you have absolute monarchy here, at the title screen I put absolutism, is a system where the ruler actually holds complete power. What they say goes. They don't need to check with anybody else or tell anybody else. The king's the king, so he can do what he wants, he can say what he wants, case in point. Really, in the 1700s or prior to the 1700s, absolute monarchy comes from this concept that was pretty much believed across Europe. This concept that was called divine right. And the concept of divine right basically ties back to these rulers, these kings, believe that not only are they just the king because it's a good idea, but they are the king because they are some sort of anointed or chosen by God. So these rulers, they receive their power from God. Therefore, one would argue you don't want to mess with God. Okay, if God gives you the power, he must know what he's doing. So again, we need to obey because he is receiving his rights, his rules, his direction, and again, his authority directly from God. All right, let's go ahead and get some visuals. If we're talking about absolute monarchs, here's a short video that kind of ties in a little review on absolutism, but also giving some examples of some absolute monarchs. Here we go.
Throughout the 15 and 1600s, absolutism became dominant through much of Europe and parts of Asia. The people who ran these civilizations were called monarchs, and they had full and complete power, and very pretentious titles. The ones you'll absolutely want to know are Akbar the Great from India, Louis XIV of France, also known as Louis the Great, and finally Peter. You guessed it, the Great, from Russia. Let's start with India, where Akbar the Great was ruler of the Mughal Empire. How great was he? Well, Akbar literally translates into the Great. So you could just call him the Great, or Akbar the Repetitive. Instead, though, you might remember him as Akbar the Religiously Tolerant, because he really was. This is a big deal, since most absolute monarchs claim that they ruled because of divine right. This was the belief that they had been chosen by God to rule. And as you've seen, people usually don't want to argue with God. But Akbar the Repetitive was open to other religious beliefs and focused on ideas of unity and tolerance in his empire, which actually is pretty great. Next, let's look at Louis XIV in France. He declared himself the Sun King, choosing this as a symbol of power to command complete loyalty from his subjects. And maybe because the Great was becoming a little cliche. Louis also built the most awesomely impressive Palace of Versailles, which is a wonderful place to take in the sun. Very fitting for the Sun King. Now let's head over to Russia, which was once ruled by an absolute monarch who, surprisingly, was not known as the Great. He was known as Ivan the Terrible. And unsurprisingly, he was ruthless and terrible. But fast forward 200 years, and we get to Peter the Great, an absolute ruler who actually earned the name by doing some truly great things. Peter westernized Russia, establishing warm water ports, and built the city of St. Petersburg. That will cover the major rulers we'll look at. But before we leave absolutism, let's remember, all great things must come to an end. And for the end, we'll look over to England. While other nations accepted absolutism, England stood in contrast. After the